Dear learners, welcome to another lecture entitled Gender Roles, Norms, Seasonality and Nutritional Outcomes. I am Dr. R. Padmaja, a senior scientist from the International Crops Research Institute for the Semi-Arid Tropics, or ICRISAT as it is commonly called. And ICRISAT is based in Hyderabad, India. Now in this lecture, I am going to give you an understanding about what is meant by gender roles, gender stereotypes, time use and nutritional outcomes. There is another video by Professor Nitya Rao which explains in detail the concepts of what is meant by gender, empowerment, agency and the process of empowerment. This lecture is a sequel to Professor Nitya Rao's lecture. Towards the end of my presentation or lecture, I will give you a link to a video documentary which showcases the role or the life of a woman in a rural area. So this video entitled A Day in the Life will give you by example on the different concepts that I will be introducing to you. So let's get started. Our learning objectives for this lecture are threefold. 1. What do we understand by gender roles, gender norms, social norms and nutritional outcomes? The second objective is why is this understanding important for development and well-being? And lastly, how do gender roles, norms influence nutritional outcomes for men, women and children? Professor Nitya Rao in her lecture had already explained the differences between the terms sex and gender. The other dimensions include roles, rights, responsibilities, and relationships. For example, what are the different activities that men and women do in everyday life? The same person can be a mom to someone, an aunt to somebody else, a sister to some others, a daughter to her parents, and so on. Hence, we cannot treat all men and women alike. Depending on their role or relationship, the benefits of the resources may be different. Another dimension of gender is one that determines access to and control over resources and benefits. Gender roles vary over time and cultures or context. Who has power and what drives these power relations is another dimension of gender. Behaviors, values, attitudes ascribed by a society is yet another dimension of gender. Let's look at gender stereotypes. A gender stereotype is a generalized view or preconception about attributes or characteristics or the roles that are ought to be possessed by or performed by women and men. See the box beside for some examples for stereotypes. As you can see from this box, women or girls are expected to be dependent, passive, homely, soft-spoken, among others. If a girl talks very loudly, then people immediately say, be like a girl, talk softly, don't shout. Similarly with men, there are some attributes assigned to men and boys. If a man or a boy cries, immediately they are reprimanded. A gender stereotype is harmful when it limits men's or women's capacity to develop their personal abilities, pursue their professional careers, and or make choices about their lives. Let me give you an example here. In earlier days in India, women or girls were not allowed to study engineering as the society then felt that engineering is a tough subject. You have to deal with machines, be rough and tough. Hence, it is not suitable for girls. This is quite harmful for girls because even if they have the interest and the ability, they could not take up such courses. Now, moving a little more into gender stereotypes, there are four basic kinds of gender stereotypes. The first one is based on personality characteristics. For example, women are often expected to be accommodating and emotional, while men are usually expected to be self-confident and aggressive. The second type is depending on the domestic behaviors. For example, many people expect that women will take care of the children, cook and clean the home, while men take care of finances, work on their cars or their yards, and do the house repairs. The third dimension of gender stereotypes is based on occupations. Some people are quick to assume that teachers and nurses are usually women and that pilots, doctors, and engineers are men. And the last type is based on the physical appearance. For example, women are expected to be thin and graceful, while men are expected to be tall and muscular. Men and women are also expected to dress and groom in ways that are stereotypical to their gender. For example, men wearing pants and short hairstyles, women wearing dresses and makeup. Now let's move on to what do we mean by gender roles. Now, gender roles refer to behaviors, actions, and attitudes that the specific culture defines as more appropriate for males and or females. For example, in this picture or illustration, you can see that only 6% men participate in cooking. Every society, ethnic group, and culture has gender role expectations, but they can be very different from group to group. They can also change in the same society over time. Now, the graph below gives an example or an illustration of how gender roles vary from group to group and how they can also change over time. For example, at the society level, societal norms and cultural values dictate what roles men and women should play. At the same time, at the system and institutional level, public policies, laws, governments also play a role in defining the gender roles. Now, from an organizational and community level perspective, example like schools, workplaces, sports club, public spaces, these also define what should be the roles that men and women should play. And lastly, the individual and relationship level, that is the individual knowledge, your attitudes, your relationships with family and friends and other members in your community also will define what roles one should be playing. Now, there have been changes in the gender roles, as I have said earlier, that they can vary over time and over cultures. Now, let's look at the gender roles then and now. Long back in history, think about gender roles and how they have always been perceived. This picture on this slide actually shows you very clearly that men go to work, they do not do housework, and when they are back from work, they read newspapers, take care of the yard, car, etc. A woman or a mom, on the other hand, stays at home to take care of children. She cooks, cleans the house, does laundry, etc. Now, the World War II changed everything. Women had to be sent to work, and that's how they started going out in the factories doing hard labor, and then we can see the changes in the gender roles evolving slowly over time. Now, all occupations can be done or are eligible to be performed by both men and women, boys and girls. Women, as you can see in the middle picture, are now going out for employment, whereas men are taking care of their children and household responsibilities. And the last picture on this slide shows who does what in this current scenario. As you can see from the picture, 50% of the women do dishes, whereas 50% of the men are also doing the dishes and the laundry, as you can see from this graphic. Now, let's go a little more detail into what are the roles of women. Now, women play multiple roles, and many of the roles of women often go unnoticed. The triple burdens, especially in the rural areas of fetching water, fuel and firewood and fodder, are not recognized as work or roles. Hence, you could see that many of these roles go unnoticed. Many of the roles which women play within the home, field, community and society, and their contributions to the economy continue to go unrecognized because their work is not easily counted within the conventional economic structures. Much of women's work remains invisible within official statistics as it is largely performed within the informal sector or their household. The problem stems from the way work has been defined. both in theory and in conventional statistics, as a paid economic activity linked to the market. So, the lack of data then often leads to a neglect of gender analysis and women's perspectives and contributions within policy making. Men and women, as I have said, have very different roles and responsibilities and relationships to the unpaid care economy or the reproductive sector, which shapes their interface with labor markets. As you can see in this slide, the specificity of women's position with respect to employment and social protection, given the fact that they stand at the crossroads of the paid and the unpaid care economy, overrepresented within the informal economy, and disproportionately implicated in the unpaid work that goes into reproducing labor, families, and households. This has two key implications. First, policy needs to take account of women's employment trajectories as they are rather than as they ought to be according to some androcentric vision. This will bring to the front gender-based inequalities in types of employment, earnings, and lifelong contributions. Second, given these gender-based inequalities, three different but potentially complementary strategies are needed for equalizing social protection outcomes for women and men. Now, using a case study by ICRISAT, I would like to explain the overall time use patterns by gender, and this is represented in this graph that you can see on this slide. Using the classification of energy costs and activities, the graph reveals that compared to men, women spend a total of 539 minutes, that is about 2 hours more than men, on activities requiring more energy. See the activities in the red bracket in the graph. Similarly, they spent about 2 hours less than men on leisure, personal care, and other activities. In a typical day of 24 hours, excluding sleeping and resting time, which constitutes a little more than 9 hours for men and women reduce their leisure time by an hour and a half to accommodate the additional time demands on them for domestic, family care, farm, and non-farm activities. Similar results are also found in other countries like Uganda, which have similar agroecologies, and as you can see, women's overall work burden is greater than that of men. So this explains the evidence gap in participation of women and men in the formal and informal economy. Now moving on, and again using the same case study from ICRISAT, we cannot treat all men and women as a homogeneous group. Let's look who spends how much time on different activities from an age perspective. As you can see from this table, compared to men and women in the age group of 18 to 29 years, it can be clearly seen that both men and women in the age groups of 30 to 49 years spend more time on farming, non-farm and livestock activities. Women cut down or reduce their time in domestic and care activities and leisure time to compensate for this workload. Younger men, that is within the age group of 18 to 29 years, look for opportunities outside of farming and related activities. Young women, on the other hand, have more demands on their time with domestic, family care and other responsibilities at home as they are in the childbearing and rearing age group. Even though I use an example from the rural areas, similar results can be found even within the urban and the peri-urban settings. Now let's move a little more into looking into rural areas with a particular emphasis on agriculture. Looking at the gender roles in agriculture, an examination of the operation-wise participation of women and men in agriculture reveals that involvement of women has increased over time, not only in terms of the number of hours per hectare, but also in the number of operations. In the early years, that is from 1975-76, women were involved mostly in sowing, weeding and harvesting operations. But gradually, over time, their role in land preparation, irrigation, plant protection and post-harvest processing also became evident, and there is an increase in the time burden of women, as you can see from this graph. Continuing on to gender roles, time burden, let's also look at it from a seasonality perspective. The two pictures presented in this slide shows how responsibilities are distributed by gender and how seasonal variations affect time use for women and men. Whose workload is more and at what time of the year? As you can see from both these pictures, women's workload is more all throughout the year compared to men. How does this workload impact on the nutritional outcomes? Are women and men getting enough food to eat or nutritious food to eat during the year, or are there periods when they have less food to eat? These can be answered by understanding their work burdens by season and then link them to food production, availability, and consumption. With this lens, we can understand how gender roles and seasonality can influence nutritional outcomes for both men and women. Now let's shift gears and talk a little more about gender and social norms. What are they? What do we mean by gender and social norms, and why understanding this is important for our everyday life and also in understanding gender differences in work, time use, and nutritional outcome? The notion of gender norms emerged in the context of larger debates among academics, gender practitioners, and activists around the nature of gender. Most existing social systems are deeply hierarchical, privileging that which is more masculine or male over that which is female or feminine, although this need not be the case. Gender norms are the social rules and expectations that keep the gender system intact. In the last decade of the 20th century, and more so after 2000, as several international agencies and bodies were making a global commitment to promote gender equality, the term gender norms entered the vocabulary, replacing early references to gendered power imbalances between men and women. Even though much work on gender norms was directed towards promoting women's rights and well-being, work on men and masculinity also contributed to this increased interest in gender norms. It started to be recognized how the existing norms of masculinity are not just harmful to women but also to men themselves. Now, having understood gender norms, let us try to understand what do we mean by social norms. Social norms are in the mind. People's beliefs are shaped by their experiences of other people's actions and manifestations of approval and disapproval. For example, beliefs that originate from observing what people do and like. Now, gender norms are produced and reproduced through people's actions and enforced by power holders who benefit from people's compliance with them. For example, the way a particular group or category of people talk, dress, move, etc. A good example of this is people, both men and women, who represent boards of organizations and have an expectation to wear a blazer. Now, social norms, on the other hand, are usually stable but maintain themselves, not necessarily benefiting anyone. For example, a norm of wearing seat belts in the car. This is a social norm. Now, let's read some more about gender and social norms. Gender norms are often studied as shaping people's individual attitudes. People follow the gender norms of their culture, society, or group, the boundaries of which are usually blurred. Example, in patriarchal societies in India, people have positive attitude towards men's authority in the household as they are considered as the head of the household. Now, social norms, on the other hand, are often studied as diverging from people's individual attitudes. People follow the social norms of their reference group, that is office group, friend circle, classrooms, etc., the boundaries of which are usually fairly defined. Example, in India, in many instances, students asking too many questions to the teacher may not be an accepted social norm, even though the student has a personal attitude to get doubts clarified. Changing gender norms requires changing institutions and power dynamics. Often this will happen through conflicts and renegotiation of the status quo. It is a political project that leads to equality between men and women. Example of this is ensuring education of girl child all over India. The policy of free education for all and also the Beti Padhao Beti Bachao Andolan kind of campaigns has helped change people's beliefs on education of the girl child. Now, changing social norms in its simplest form requires changing people's misperceptions of what others do and approve of in their reference groups. It leads to greater well-being for women and men. Example, reducing child abuse. For this change to happen, 3 strategies are needed: personalized normative feedback, messaging through many means for behavior change, and small group discussions to correct these misconceptions. Now, let's also try to understand why applying a systems approach to gender in the process of innovation and adoption is important. In order to better understand rural livelihood systems, considerations must be given to exploring the complex interconnections between the multiple components of such systems, that is, the context, the assets, and the strategies, including linkages between rural and urban economies. Gender roles, norms, and identities influence the opportunities that women and men have to uptake of particular practices and technologies. For instance, if an extension program is organized during the peak paddy transplanting season, women have little time to spare. It is unlikely that the extension agency will be successful in disseminating or scaling the technology at hand. It is not that women are not interested, but rather they lack time. They may also be unwilling to participate in extension programs as they have no control over land or money or decision making within the household. Continuing further on the systems approach, for successful uptake of innovations, 3 important points to be considered. Social institutions and societal traditions and norms affect how farmers, that is both men and women, interact with and learn from each other, and how they produce, disseminate, and utilize knowledge. Gender norms often underpin roles and practices in the household and on the farm and have significant influence on how women and men participate and benefit from such processes, where gender roles and responsibilities are differentiated. It is therefore important to understand 2 questions. First, what are the common gender roles and practices in the households and farm? And second, how do these roles and practices influence participation in learning processes, innovation processes, and uptake of innovations? Such an analysis can contribute to more successful uptake of innovations on the ground. Now, let's move towards gender roles, time use, and nutrition. Again, we use a case study from ICROSAT to understand gender roles, time use, and nutritional outcomes. Read Padmaja Raula et al. 2019 for a complete story and full insights about this. A recent systematic review of evidence on agriculture, time use, and nutrition in rural areas in many low and middle income countries show evidence that women play a key role in agriculture, and this is reflected in their time commitments to these activities either as farm workers or farm managers. It is also revealed that women are important actors in the uptake of and response to agricultural interventions, which tend to increase time burdens for women, men, and children. Nutritional impacts are varied because households respond to increased time burden and workload in different ways and suggest that the link between time burden and nutrition is complex. While confirming the importance of women's agricultural role, providing new evidence that agricultural interventions may tend to increase time burdens of beneficiaries is something that has been learned. The review also concludes that while changing time use tends to change nutritional outcomes, the pathways are complex and there is no agreement on the impact. These evidences clearly identify time use as an important data and suggest that understanding gender time use patterns helps in appreciating the different socio-economic contexts that go into forming gender and nutrition policies, program perspectives, and recommendations. Now, the case study also provides evidence to understand the effects of time demands on men and women in different activities on their nutritional status. First and foremost, it provides evidence of the magnitude of malnutrition by gender. Of the sample men, 62% have normal nutritional status and 38% are malnourished. Of these, 23% are undernourished and 15% overnourished. Compared to this, only 54% of women are well nourished and 46% are malnourished. Second, the data clearly shows the gender differences in time use and nutrition. Men who are underweight spend less time in high energy consuming activities. It could be either domestic work, farm, non-farm and livestock activities, and spend more time on leisure, sleeping and resting. This indicates that their poor nutritional status prevents them from indulging in more intensive activities and that they may be tired easily. Hence, they spend more time sleeping and resting compared to men who have normal body mass indices and are overweight. The picture for women is different. The analysis reveals that in spite of being underweight and having a body mass index of less than 18.5, women are more involved in high energy consuming activities compared to overnourished women. Moreover, they spend less time on leisure and personal care, and this further affects their nutritional status. Thirdly, looking at the diversity of diets or diet quality, the findings also suggest that there is no difference in the diet quality of men who are normal or malnourished. In the case of women, it is surprising to note that women who are undernourished have the most diversity in diets compared to normal or overweight women, which is a matter for further study and understanding. So, what does all this information that I have presented in this lecture mean for development? So, let's conclude that context matters. In my entire presentation, I've been talking about varying cultures, over time, different contexts. So, context matters. Gender roles, stereotypes, norms vary across cultures and regions and change over time. Hence, a one-size-fits-all approach will not work for bringing about the desired change in any dimension. Now, second is recognizing multiple roles. Women play multiple roles, paid and unpaid, productive and reproductive, household and community level. This has to be recognized and appropriate interventions for improving their well-being and also economic, social and technological empowerment. Third, integrating gender in a systems approach. For successful uptake of innovations, understanding and interpreting gender in the appropriate method is the key. Also, it is important to fill the data void. Generate data disaggregated by gender, class, age, ethnicity on roles, responsibilities, norms, and nutritional outcomes for better policy and program formulation and implementation. And lastly, make the invisible visible. As mentioned in the beginning, I would like to share with you a case study through a video documentary presented in the title, A Day in the Life of a Woman. Now, in this video documentary, we will clearly explain whatever I have said so far about the different gender roles, stereotypes, and how men and women face different levels of inclusion and exclusion in the rural society. So, enjoy the video, A Day in the Life of a Woman. Please refer to the references that are given in the chapter for more detailed understanding of gender roles, seasonality, norms, and nutrition. We are working collectively with several partners, as you can see from this slide, to bring about useful and interesting lectures for you. Happy learning, dear learners. Thank you.